scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Peppa's family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's house in the countryside. But as their blue car wound through the narrow country roads, something felt terribly wrong. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of twisted branches that blocked out most of the gray sky above. When they finally arrived at Grandpa Pig's house, it looked different than Peppa remembered. The cheerful yellow walls had faded to a sickly pale color, and the windows were all covered with thick, dark curtains. Grandpa Pig greeted them at the door, but his usual warm smile seemed forced, and his eyes had a strange, distant look. Inside the house, everything was too quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped ticking, its hands frozen at midnight. The family photographs on the walls showed faces that Peppa didn't recognize, even though they were supposed to be pictures of her relatives. In each photo, the subjects had the same empty, staring eyes. Grandpa Pig led them to the sitting room, where Granny Pig was waiting. She sat perfectly still in her rocking chair, but the chair wasn't moving. When she turned to look at Peppa, her face was exactly the same as always, except for her smile, which stretched just a little too wide and showed too many teeth. During dinner, the food on Peppa's plate kept changing when she wasn't looking directly at it. The carrots would turn into something that looked like tiny orange fingers, and the peas would roll around on their own, forming strange patterns. When she tried to tell Mummy Pig about it, her mother just nodded and continued eating as if nothing was happening. After dinner, Grandpa Pig suggested they play a game of hide and seek in the old barn behind the house. The barn was much larger inside than it appeared from the outside, with endless rows of hay bales that seemed to stretch on forever. As Peppa counted to 10 with her eyes closed, she could hear whispers coming from somewhere deep within the barn. When she opened her eyes and began searching for her family, she realized that the barn had become a maze. Every turn led to another identical corridor of hay bales, and the whispers grew louder and more urgent. The voices sounded like her family, but they were saying things that didn't make sense, speaking in a language that was almost English but not quite right. Peppa found George first, hiding behind a hay bale in what seemed like the center of the maze. But when he turned around, his face was upside down, with his mouth where his eyes should be and his eyes where his mouth should be. He giggled in his usual way, but the sound came out backwards and echoed strangely in the vast space. Next, she found Daddy Pig, but he was standing on the ceiling, looking down at her with his head tilted at an impossible angle. His glasses had fallen off, but they were floating in the air beside him, spinning slowly. When he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted and slow. Mummy Pig was the hardest to find because she kept moving. Every time Peppa thought she saw her orange dress around a corner, it would disappear, leaving only the sound of high-heeled shoes clicking on wooden floors that shouldn't exist in a barn full of hay. As the game continued, Peppa began to realize that the barn was changing around her. The hay bales were rearranging themselves, creating new paths and blocking old ones. The ceiling seemed to be getting higher, and strange shadows moved across the walls even though there was no light source to cast them. Finally, Peppa found herself back where she started, but now her entire family was standing in a circle around her. They all looked normal again, but they were perfectly synchronized, moving and breathing at exactly the same time. When they spoke, their voices overlapped to create a harmony that was beautiful and terrifying. They told Peppa that the game wasn't over yet, that there was one more person to find. But Peppa knew she had found everyone. That's when she realized they were talking about finding herself, the version of herself that had entered the barn, the one who still believed the scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows that moved independently. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos had changed. In every picture, the smiles were too wide. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as always, but she stood completely still, her back turned to Peppa. When Peppa called out "Good morning," Mummy Pig slowly turned around, revealing that same impossibly wide smile. Her voice sounded hollow. She offered Peppa her favorite cereal, but the bowl was filled with something dark and moving. George was already at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur toy. Instead, he sat perfectly motionless, staring straight ahead with unblinking eyes. When Peppa tried to get his attention, he turned his head toward her with a mechanical clicking sound. Daddy Pig emerged from behind his newspaper, but the paper was blank, completely white. He folded it carefully and placed it on the table. When he spoke, his voice echoed strangely. He suggested they all go for a drive. The family walked outside together, but their movements were synchronized in an unnatural way, like marionettes. The neighborhood looked the same, but all the other houses had their curtains drawn. The only sounds were their footsteps and a strange humming from underground. As they approached the car, Peppa noticed that their reflections in the windows were wrong. While the family stood together, their reflections showed them in different positions. The car doors opened by themselves. Inside the car, the radio played a song that Peppa had never heard before, but somehow knew all the words to. The melody was familiar yet wrong, like a lullaby played backwards. As they drove through town, all the shops were open, but no one was inside them. They arrived at a playground that Peppa didn't recognize. The swings moved by themselves and other children were playing, but they all looked exactly like Peppa and George, dozens of identical copies running in perfect circles. When Peppa tried to join them, she realized that she couldn't move her legs properly. Looking down, she saw that her feet were sinking into the ground. The other children stopped playing and turned to look at her, all wearing the same expression of hollow joy. As the scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up. The sun was shining, but something felt different. The toys seemed to be watching them with glassy eyes, and the shadows appeared darker than usual. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast. The familiar yellow walls should have been comforting, but there was an odd silence. The clock had stopped ticking. As they sat at the table, they noticed Mummy Pig's reflection was smiling even when she wasn't. The family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's garden. The car ride was unusually quiet. As they arrived, the flowers seemed to turn their heads to follow them as they walked past. Grandpa Pig greeted them with his warm smile, but his eyes seemed hollow. He invited them into the living room where the television showed only static. His voice echoed strangely as he spoke about his vegetables. In the garden, George noticed that all the vegetables had grown faces. Carrots with tiny eyes, potatoes with crooked smiles, and tomatoes that whispered his name. He dropped his toy and ran toward the house. Peppa was helping water the plants when she realized the watering can was pouring something dark. The liquid made the flowers grow instantly, but they grew wrong with twisted stems. The roses developed thorns that looked like tiny teeth. The family gathered for tea. The tea was purple, and steam rose from it in shapes that looked like screaming faces. Nobody seemed to notice except Peppa, who watched in horror as her family drank the mysterious liquid. When leaving, they found their car had changed. The headlights looked like glowing eyes, and the grille resembled a grinning mouth. Daddy Pig started the engine, and it made a sound like distant laughter. The drive home took them through unfamiliar streets. The houses had windows that looked like watching eyes. At home, everything appeared normal, but the family photographs showed them with different expressions. In every picture, their smiles were too wide. That evening, the food on their plates kept changing. Peppa would see spaghetti, then blink and find tiny worms. At bedtime, their reflections in the bathroom mirror were delayed. The toothpaste foam swirled into shapes like tiny hands. In their bedroom, the wallpaper seemed to move and breathe. The toys had all turned to face their beds. George's dinosaur toy was no longer green but sickly gray. As Peppa lay in bed, she heard whispers from inside the walls. The voices spoke in an unknown language. George fell asleep but wasn't safe in his dreams. Peppa saw him tossing and turning. The night stretched endlessly with strange sounds. Footsteps in the hallway when everyone should be asleep. As dawn approached, the whispers faded. But Peppa knew this wasn't the end. The sun rose on another ordinary day, but they would never see their world the same way. When Mummy Pig called for breakfast, Peppa could hear an echo underneath. The horror had begun. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked around the room. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but there was an unsettling silence that made her skin crawl. George was still sleeping peacefully in his bed, clutching his beloved dinosaur toy. Peppa decided to wake him up, but when she reached over to shake his shoulder, her hand passed right through him. She gasped and tried again, but the same thing happened. George was there, but somehow he wasn't really there at all. Confused and frightened, Peppa ran downstairs to find Mummy and Daddy Pig. The house felt eerily quiet as her footsteps echoed through the hallways. When she reached the kitchen, she found her parents sitting at the breakfast table, but they weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, their eyes wide open, staring straight ahead with blank expressions on their faces. Peppa called out to them, but they didn't respond. She waved her hands in front of their faces, but they remained motionless like statues. Their breakfast sat untouched on the table, growing cold. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, each tick seeming louder and more ominous than the last. Desperate for answers, Peppa ran outside to find her friends. The playground was empty, but she could hear children laughing in the distance. Following the sound, she discovered all her friends playing together, but when she approached them, they couldn't see or hear her. She was invisible to everyone she cared about. As the day progressed, Peppa realized she was trapped in a world where she existed but didn't belong. She could see everything happening around her, but she couldn't interact with anyone or anything. The familiar places of her childhood had become a prison of loneliness and fear. The worst part came when night fell. As darkness crept across the town, the shadows began to move on their own. They stretched and twisted into impossible shapes, reaching out toward Peppa with long, grasping fingers. She ran through the empty streets, but the shadows followed her everywhere she went. Finally, Peppa found herself back in her bedroom, where George was still sleeping peacefully. She sat on her bed and began to cry, wondering if she would ever be able to touch her family again, or if she was doomed to wander this strange, isolated world forever. The shadows gathered around her window, pressing against the glass, waiting for their chance to take her away completely. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows across the walls. As she walked downstairs, she noticed the family portraits had changed. In each picture, the smiles were too wide, the eyes too bright. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, but when she turned around, her usual warm smile had been replaced by something unsettling. Her teeth seemed sharper, and her eyes held a glint that made Peppa's stomach turn. "Good morning, my dear," Mummy Pig said in a voice with an odd echo. George was at the table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring at his plate with unblinking eyes. When Peppa called his name, he slowly turned his head, and she gasped. His face was the same, but something behind his eyes had changed completely. Daddy Pig emerged from behind his newspaper. His glasses reflected the light in a way that made it impossible to see his eyes. "What a lovely day for a family outing," he announced, though no one had mentioned going anywhere. The car ride felt endless. The familiar countryside had become a maze of identical trees that seemed to watch them pass. The radio played the same tune over and over, but the melody gradually became distorted. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were there, but they stood in perfect formation, not playing or laughing. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, and Pedro Pony turned to look at Peppa simultaneously, their movements synchronized. "Let's play a new game," Susie suggested, her voice carrying that same distant echo. The game involved standing in a circle and staring at the center, where nothing visible existed, but everyone seemed to see something that filled them with quiet joy. As the day progressed, Peppa noticed that time moved differently. Conversations would repeat exactly, but each time, the speaker's expressions became more intense. The playground equipment cast shadows that didn't match the sun, and those shadows moved independently. When evening came, the family returned home, but the house felt larger inside. Rooms appeared where hallways should be, and familiar furniture had been rearranged in impossible ways. The television showed the same program on every—
Scary Peppa Pig Episode 2, The Birthday Party That Never Ends. Today is Rebecca Rabbit's birthday party, and Peppa is very excited to go. Mummy Pig drives Peppa and George to Rebecca's house, which looks strangely different from usual. The windows are covered with dark curtains, and there are no other cars in the driveway. "Are we early, Mummy?" asks Peppa, looking at the empty street. "No, darling, you're right on time," Mummy Pig replies, but her voice sounds distant and hollow. Peppa and George walk up to the front door. When they knock, the door creaks open by itself. Inside, the house is dimly lit with flickering candles instead of normal lights. The decorations are all black and purple instead of the usual bright colors. "Hello, Rebecca?" calls Peppa, but there's no answer. They walk into the living room where they see all their friends sitting perfectly still around a birthday table. Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, Susie Sheep, and Candy Cat are all there, but something is wrong. They're not moving or talking, they just stare straight ahead with empty, glassy eyes. "Why isn't anyone talking?" whispers George, hiding behind Peppa. Peppa approaches the table. The birthday cake is covered in black frosting with candles that never seem to burn down. The same Happy Birthday Rebecca song plays over and over from an old music box, but it sounds distorted and slow. "Rebecca, are you okay?" Peppa asks, touching her friend's shoulder. Rebecca slowly turns her head toward Peppa. Her usual smile is gone, replaced by a blank expression. "The party never ends, Peppa," she says in a monotone voice. "We've been waiting for you." Suddenly, all the children turn to look at Peppa at the same time. Their eyes are completely black, and they all speak in unison. "Join us, Peppa. The party never ends." Peppa grabs George's hand and tries to run to the door, but it's locked. The windows won't open either. The birthday song keeps playing, getting louder and more distorted. "We can't leave." George starts to cry. The other children slowly stand up from their chairs and begin walking toward Peppa and George. They move in perfect synchronization, like dolls being controlled by invisible strings. "Don't be scared," says Pedro Pony, but his voice doesn't sound like Pedro anymore. "The party is so much fun. We play the same games forever and ever." Peppa notices that the room is getting smaller. The walls are slowly moving inward, and the ceiling is getting lower. The birthday decorations are changing too. The balloons are deflating and turning gray, and the streamers are falling like spider webs. "I want to go home," cries Peppa, but her voice echoes strangely, as if the room is much bigger than it appears. The music box suddenly stops playing. In the silence, Peppa can hear something else. The sound of children laughing, but it's coming from somewhere far away, like an echo from another world. Rebecca approaches Peppa with a birthday hat in her hands. "Put this on, Peppa. Then you can stay forever too." As Rebecca places the hat on Peppa's head, everything goes dark. When the lights flicker back on, Peppa is sitting at the birthday table with the others. She has the same blank expression and glassy eyes. George is the only one left standing, looking at his sister in horror. "Peppa," he whispers. Peppa slowly turns to look at George. "Join us, George," she says in the same monotone voice as the others. The party never ends. The birthday song starts playing again, and George realizes he's trapped in this endless birthday party where no one ever gets older, no one ever goes home, and the celebration never, ever stops. The camera slowly zooms out through the window, showing the house from outside. In every window, you can see the silhouettes of children sitting perfectly still around birthday tables, all celebrating parties that will never end. And somewhere in the distance, you can hear the faint sound of Happy Birthday being sung over and over again, forever.